What if everything you've ever been told about the pyramids is wrong? Not just missing a few details. Not just, we're still figuring some things out, but completely, fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. Because the pyramids of Giza, the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, the hidden chambers carved deep into the bedrock, might have been standing for thousands of years before the first pharaoh put on a crown, before Egyptian writing, before Egypt as we know it even existed. Let's start with the evidence we've been trained to ignore. The Sphinx is scarred by water. Not wind, not sand, rain. Heavy, sustained rainfall that hasn't touched this part of the desert in nearly 9,000 years. That alone pushes its age back into a time when this land was green. The Great Pyramid, on the other hand, behaves less like a tomb and more like a piece of advanced engineering. Its dimensions encode mathematical constants. Pi, phi, ratios related to the Earth itself. No priest from the 4th dynasty should have known the exact radius of the Earth, or how to build a monument that silently contains that information in stone. Inside its passages, you don't find what you'd expect from a royal burial. No hieroglyphs on the walls, no mummies, no gold, no ritual paintings or prayers for the dead. Just narrow corridors, impossible precision, granite chambers, strange acoustic properties, and sealed shafts leading to doors we're not allowed to explore. Even the ancient Egyptians left hints that these monuments were already old when they walked among them. Some texts don't describe the pyramids and the Sphinx as new constructions, but as relics that their kings found and then repaired. That raises a question almost no one in mainstream history wants to touch. If Khufu didn't build a Great Pyramid, who did? And why has that possibility been buried as deeply as the chambers beneath the sand? Night falls over the Giza plateau, and the whole scene changes. As the sun drops, the limestone turns gold, then fades into deep amber. Long shadows stretch across the sand like fingers reaching from another age. The Sphinx crouches at the edge of the escarpment, half buried, its face weathered and scarred by forces that shouldn't exist in this desert. Behind it, the 3 pyramids rise in perfect alignment, their edges sharp against the dimming sky. They dominate the horizon so completely that distance itself seems to warp around them. Tour buses rumble away. Voices fade. The last tourists disappear back toward Cairo. And in the stillness that follows, something shifts. The pyramids stop feeling like tourist attractions and become what they truly are, ancient questions carved in stone, waiting in silence. We've all been given the same tidy story. You probably know it by heart. The pyramids were built during Egypt's 4th dynasty, around 2580 BCE. Pharaoh Khufu commands the construction of the Great Pyramid as his tomb, a monument to secure his journey into the afterlife. Tens of thousands of workers, organized by the state, hauled 2.3 million limestone blocks up ramps using copper chisels, ropes, and sheer human determination. Khufu's son Khafre supposedly builds the 2nd pyramid and has the Sphinx carved in his own image. A 3rd pyramid follows under Menkaure. Together, these become the crown jewels of ancient Egypt, the peak of their engineering and social organization. A clean, inspiring story. Stone and sweat, kings and eternity. Textbooks repeat it. Museums display it. Tour guides recite it to crowds staring up in awe. But the desert remembers differently. As twilight settles and the air cools, doubt's creeping away shadows slide along the base of those stones. What if the standard tale isn't exactly wrong, but only a late chapter in a much older story? What if the ancient Egyptians didn't build these structures from scratch, but inherited them? What if they restored something that had already been standing for thousands of years, and then folded those monuments into their own culture and religion? This idea isn't coming from fantasy novels or conspiracy forums. It comes from anomalies, hard evidence, that simply refuses to fit neatly into the official narrative. Let's go back to the Sphinx. If you walk down into the enclosure that surrounds it, you'll notice something most tourists never really look at. The walls carved deep into the limestone bedrock. Those walls are not smooth. They're not etched with little wind-carved ripples. They're cut with deep vertical grooves, rounded channels, soft, wave-like shapes that look as if water has flowed over them again and again. That's not what wind does to stone. That's what rain does. Heavy, sustained rainfall over a very long period of time. But here's the problem. The Giza plateau hasn't seen that kind of climate for almost 9,000 years. Long before the first Egyptian dynasty. Long before hieroglyphs. Long before the Nile settled into its modern course. Rain fell here, and the Sphinx was already standing, taking that water damage. Now shift to the Great Pyramid. You'd expect a royal tomb to be plastered with religious texts, full of paintings, funerary goods, inscriptions begging the gods for safe passage. But inside the Great Pyramid, you get none of that. No hieroglyphs, no carved spells, no colorful murals, no treasures that indicate a royal burial. Just stark precision, granite chambers, resonant passages, a massive granite box without a lid, and shafts pointing with uncanny accuracy to specific stars. The structure encodes pi and phi. It mirrors Earth's polar radius and other geodetic data in its proportions. Its passages align with stars in ways that require a level of astronomical knowledge we're not supposed to attribute to the Fourth Dynasty. Everything about it screams purpose, but not the purpose we're told. It's not behaving like a tomb. It's behaving like something else entirely. And then there are the sealed doors. In 1993, a small robot explored one of the narrow shafts inside the pyramid and found a tiny limestone door with copper pins embedded in it. Years later, when a hole was finally drilled through, a second door appeared behind the first. Further scans revealed strange voids inside the pyramid and beneath the Sphinx. And just when the discoveries started getting interesting, exploration slowed down, permissions tightened, access was restricted, official explanations stayed vague. Meanwhile, the ancient texts that do talk about these monuments tell a different story than the one you get in a classroom. The Inventory Stela describes Khufu not as the proud builder of the Great Pyramid, but as a man who found these structures already in place and restored them. The Dream Stela, placed between the paws of the Sphinx, shows a later pharaoh, Thutmose IV, digging the Sphinx out of sand as if it had been buried and forgotten long before his time. That doesn't sound like the language of creators. It sounds like a language of inheritors, people stumbling onto something ancient, recognizing its power, and doing their best to preserve it. If that's even partly true, if the pyramids and the Sphinx predate dynastic Egypt by thousands of years, then everything we think we know about human history has to be rewritten. History stops looking like a straight line from primitive hunter-gatherers to modern civilization and starts to look more like a cycle. Cultures rise, reach heights of knowledge and skill, then fall. Their secrets get scattered, encoded, half-remembered myths, or locked away in stone. In that version of history, the pyramids don't represent the beginning of monumental architecture. They represent what survived, relics from a lost age that made it through catastrophe, waiting quietly for someone to look at them with fresh eyes. And the clues aren't all in one place. They're scattered across fields that don't always talk to each other. Geology reads rain and stone. Archaeology finds construction techniques and precision that don't match the tools we've assigned to that era. Mythology talks about ages before the flood. Genetics reveals ghost populations erased from the historical record. Mathematics shows us Earth's dimensions hidden in monuments that supposedly were built with simple copper tools. Piece by piece, those fragments start forming a shadow story. A version of the past that's deeper, stranger, and more complex than anything we've been taught. Tonight, that's the journey we're starting. We're going to walk through stone and erosion, through ancient texts and sealed chambers, through math and myth. We'll move from Giza to sites like Göbekli Tepe, from the Nile to the stars, from a visible plateau down into the hidden voids below it. And every step will circle back to the same haunting question. What if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids? The sky over Giza darkens. The last light drains from the limestone. In that brief pause between day and night, the monuments feel like they're breathing. Not with 4,500 years of history, but with 10,000, maybe more. The pyramids don't care what story we tell about them. Empires rise and fall at their feet. Languages are born and die out. Religions come and go. The stones stay. And if you really listen, the silence isn't empty. It feels like an invitation. A question. A memory locked inside geometry and stone. The Sphinx waits. The pyramids loom. Our investigation is just beginning. If this dive into forgotten history is already tugging at something inside you, you're not alone. If you want to keep going with us into these cracks in the story of our past, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a like so more people can stumble into this rabbit hole, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I read those, and it turns this from just a video into a global conversation, because from here on, we're going to let the evidence speak for itself. And the first piece of evidence is written not in ink or hieroglyphs, but in water and stone. The geological proof that the Sphinx existed thousands of years before Egypt was even a concept. Morning breaks over the Giza plateau. The sun rises like a slow-burning ember out of haze, and as it climbs, the Sphinx comes out of shadow. From a distance, it looks eternal, a symbol of ancient Egypt that, in our minds, has always been there, always watching, always guarding. But distance is a liar. To really understand what the Sphinx is telling us, you have to get close. You have to walk down into the enclosure that cradles it, that deep rectangular pit carved into the limestone bedrock. From above, it just looks like a hollow around the statue. When you're actually inside it, it feels like you've stepped into another world. As you descend, the temperature drops. The wind from the open desert fades. The walls climb up around you like the sides of an old quarry, blocking the horizon, shutting out the city, the tour groups, everything modern. It's just you, rock, and silence. Run your hand along those walls, and this is where the illusion of the standard story starts to crack. You don't feel flat, chiseled surfaces. You don't feel the harsh, sharp edges you get from tools chipping away at stone. Instead, the rock is rounded, softened, cut with deep vertical channels. Waves in the stone, almost like it's been melted and frozen mid-flow. This is not what the wind does. This is what water does. Not a rare rainstorm or a flash flood. We're talking about centuries of regular, heavy rainfall, water pouring down, again and again, carving vertical grooves into the rock as it runs along the walls and collects at the bottom. But here's the catch. This plateau hasn't seen that kind of climate for close to 9,000 years. In 1990, a geologist named Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University came here and walked into the same enclosure. He wasn't an Egyptologist. He wasn't trained to look for kings' names or royal symbols. He was trained to read stone the way other scholars read manuscripts. To him, that weathering pattern was obvious. He saw the walls surrounding the Sphinx and recognized a hallmark of prolonged water erosion, deep vertical fissures, rounded channels, worn, soft edges. Stone that had been rained on not for a few decades, but for hundreds or thousands of years. And that immediately created a problem. Because we know from climate records, from geology, from the study of ancient lake beds and river systems, that this part of North Africa hasn't had that kind of rainfall since the end of the last ice age. Around 10,000 BC, the world was a very different place. North Africa wasn't a desert yet. It was green. Rivers flowed where today we see nothing but dunes. Lakes shimmered where now there's only sand. Grassland spread across what we call the Sahara. Hippos, crocodiles, and other water-loving animals thrived here. Rain fell heavily and regularly, shaping the landscape. Then, between about 7,000 and 5,000 BC, the climate began to shift. The monsoon belt retreated south. The rains dwindled. The Sahara slowly transformed into the massive desert we know today. By the time the so-called Fourth Dynasty rose around 2580 BC, the era when Khufu supposedly built the Great Pyramid and Khafre supposedly carved the Sphinx, this region was already arid, already dry, already the desert we recognize from postcards and documentaries. So if the walls of the Sphinx enclosure show erosion that requires centuries of heavy rainfall, and that kind of rainfall hasn't hit this plateau for nearly 9,000 years, then the conclusion is inescapable. The Sphinx had to be carved, exposed, and standing out in the open during that earlier, wetter climate, long before Khafre, long before the Old Kingdom, long before ancient Egypt, as we define it, even entered the picture. Schoch didn't just eyeball this and guess. He compared. He studied the weathering on the Sphinx and its enclosure walls, and then looked at nearby structures we do know the dates for, Old Kingdom temples, built during the Fourth Dynasty, from the same general area, using similar limestone. Those later temples show a completely different type of damage. Their surfaces are worn horizontally, smoothed and sandblasted by wind and airborne particles. Edges are still sharp where they've been protected. Corners are chipped where they've been exposed. This is textbook desert erosion, exactly what you'd expect from 4,500 years of wind and sand. Wind erosion is like sanding wood. It smooths and softens surfaces, mostly along exposed plains. It doesn't carve vertical channels that slice down the wall like dripping wax. The Sphinx enclosure, though, vertical channels, rounded grooves, rock that looks like it's been slowly eaten away from above, as water flowed and pooled and flowed again. Wind doesn't do that. Sand doesn't do that. Only water, persistent, heavy, long-term water, does that. So, shock draws a line. The temples show 4,500 years of desert weathering. The Sphinx enclosure shows something far older. Based on the erosion patterns and the known climatic shifts, he suggests a date between 7,000 and 9,000 BCE for the carving and exposure of the Sphinx and its enclosure. That's pre-pottery Neolithic, a time when, according to textbooks, humans were just starting to experiment with early agriculture. No writing, no centralized states, no pharaohs, no pyramids, no Egypt as we imagine it. If that's true, then the Sphinx doesn't belong to Khafre at all. It's not a vanity project carved in his image. It's a survivor from a completely different age. A relic from a culture we don't really have a name for. An echo from a time when the Sahara was lush and green, and someone, for reasons we don't yet understand, carved a colossal figure out of the bedrock. Think about how radical that is. If the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by 5,000, 6,000, or even 7,000 years, then by the time the Egyptians arrived on the scene, it was already ancient, already scarred by rains their own civilization never saw, already standing, half-buried, waiting. The Egyptians didn't build it, they found it. It's no surprise that Schock's conclusion sparked immediate backlash. From the point of view of mainstream Egyptology, no advanced culture capable of carving something like the Sphinx is supposed to exist in North Africa at that time. Monumental stone architecture, according to the standard timeline, appears only after complex societies take shape, after agriculture, cities, and hierarchies are firmly in place. So, the logic goes, because we don't believe such a culture existed, the Sphinx can't be that old. Therefore, the geology must be wrong. But geology doesn't care about historical timelines. Rock doesn't care what's written in our textbooks. It records the environment that touched it with cold, consistent honesty. The stone is telling a story. We're just not used to hearing it. There's another crucial detail that makes the Sphinx even more interesting. It isn't built from blocks. It's carved straight out of the living bedrock. The body of the Sphinx and the walls of the enclosure are all part of the same limestone layer. When the statue was created, the workers removed the surrounding rock to shape the body, leaving the enclosure walls as a kind of negative space around it. That means the Sphinx and its enclosure walls were exposed at the same time. Whatever weathered one, weathered the other. Schock observed that the pattern of erosion on both the Sphinx and the enclosure walls is consistent. Same style, same depth, same water-cut signatures. If the Sphinx had been carved around 2,500 BCE, as conventional history claims, the enclosure walls should show the same type of erosion as the nearby Old Kingdom temples, 4,500 years of desert wind and sand. But they don't. They show far more extensive water-based weathering that fits the earlier wetter climate instead. So you end up with a simple but devastating question. If the Sphinx is supposedly 4,500 years old, why does the rock around it appear to have stood in the rain for thousands of years before the desert even formed? Some critics tried to explain this away by pointing to later restoration work. They argued that repairs and recarving could have confused the weathering pattern. And yes, there are later additions. You can see where Egyptians patched, refaced, or reinforced parts of the structure. But the core limestone that forms the foundation of the enclosure, the deep original bedrock, still carries the primary water erosion. The newer pharaonic-era stone sits on top of those ancient, rain-scarred surfaces, like patches sewn onto an older, worn-out garment. You could distinguish the two, and the old damage is still there, still screaming, "I was carved in a time when this desert was not a desert." Now zoom out and imagine the bigger picture. Forget the modern desert for a second. Picture this landscape as it was during the African humid period. Green savanna, scattered trees, flowing rivers, seasonal lakes, animals grazing on open plains, storms rolling through, bringing sustained rain, and on a limestone plateau overlooking that fertile world, someone decides to carve a colossal figure from a rock. Maybe it started as a lion. Maybe its original face was different. Maybe it's a fusion of human and animal from the beginning. We don't know. Centuries pass. The rains fall. The monument erodes. Civilizations rise and fall in cycles we can't yet trace. Then the climate shifts. The Sahara dries. Sand creeps over once green ground. The monument is buried, forgotten, rediscovered, buried again. By the time the Egyptians show up, it's already ancient beyond memory. They dig it out. They stabilize it. Maybe they recarve the head to resemble pharaoh. They build temples around it. They weave it into their mythology. They don't claim to have built it, because they didn't. The stone itself, through its erosion, through its scars, tells a story the official narrative refuses to acknowledge. Not in words, not in hieroglyphs, but in the language of geology. And that language is very clear. The Sphinx remembers a world that no longer exists. A green Sahara, a different climate, and very likely a culture advanced enough to envision and carve a monument designed to outlast everything around it. If that's true, then the Sphinx isn't just an Egyptian icon. It's a message from a forgotten age. And if the stone is willing to contradict the textbooks this loudly, what do the Egyptian texts themselves actually say? Because they left another kind of testimony, not in weathering patterns and grooves, but in carefully carved inscriptions meant to last forever. And when you read those closely, they tell a story that lines up with the stone, not with the modern narrative. Stone speaks through erosion and weathering. But the Egyptians left another kind of record, one carved on purpose, meant to be read, meant to survive. Inscriptions, temple walls, stele. And here's where things get really interesting. Because when you read those inscriptions carefully, without forcing them to fit the modern narrative, you discover something the textbooks almost never mention. The Egyptians themselves never clearly claimed to have built the Sphinx. In fact, some of their own texts suggest they thought these monuments were already ancient when they found them. That's not a modern theory. That's not internet speculation layered onto silent stones. That comes directly from hieroglyphs carved thousands of years ago, standing in the shadow of the pyramids themselves. Let's start with one of the most controversial pieces, the Inventory Stela. It was discovered in the 19th century near the Great Pyramid and dates to the 26th dynasty, around 670 BC, far later than the time of Khufu. By then, the pyramids were already ancient even to the Egyptians. The stele looks back to Khufu's era and tells a story about what he did at Giza. According to the conventional narrative, this should be where we finally see a bold statement. Khufu built the Great Pyramid, but that's not what it says. Instead, the Inventory Stela describes Khufu as someone who found monuments already there, including the Sphinx, and restored them. It basically paints this picture. Khufu comes to Giza, discovers the Sphinx already in place but buried in sand and in need of attention, clears it, repairs it, and builds temples around it to honor the gods. The pyramids are mentioned not as brand new construction projects, but as existing structures in his time. Read that again. This is an Egyptian text, speaking about Egypt's own golden age, and it does not credit Khufu as the builder of the Great Pyramid. It frames him as a restorer, not an architect. Now, mainstream Egyptology largely waves this away. The usual explanation is, well, the Inventory Stela was carved over 2,000 years after Khufu lived. It's a late piece of propaganda. We can't take it literally. And sure, it is late. It may well contain embellishments or mythological elements. But if it's propaganda, you have to ask, propaganda for what? When a culture creates fake history for political reasons, it usually does the opposite of what the stele does. It exaggerates achievements. It inflates egos. It gives ancient kings more credit, not less. If the 26th dynasty wanted to glorify Khufu or connect themselves to a powerful legacy, Why portray him as a guy who stumbled upon old monuments and spruce him up? Why not depict him as the mastermind behind the greatest stone structure on Earth? Why downgrade him from master builder to maintenance guy? The stele doesn't sound like someone trying to rewrite history to make Khufu bigger. It sounds like someone preserving a tradition that, even in Khufu's time, the Sphinx and the pyramids were already old. And it's not alone. Step right in front of the Sphinx, between its paws, and you'll find another key inscription. The Dream Stela of Thutmose IV. This one is older than the Inventory Stela, carved around 1400 BC, still long after Khufu, but much closer to the Old Kingdom than we are. According to its text, Thutmose was still a prince when he fell asleep in the shade of the Sphinx during a hunting trip. In his dream, the Sphinx spoke to him, promising that if he cleared away the sand burying its body, he would become pharaoh. Thutmose woke up, did exactly that, excavated and restored the Sphinx, and later ascended the throne. The stele commemorates this moment. The important part isn't the dream. It's the way the monument is described. The Sphinx is presented as something already in ruins, already buried up to its neck in sand, already ancient. The text does not say, "My ancestor Khafre built this recently." It doesn't talk about a 4th dynasty construction date at all. Instead, it leans into language like from beginning and since time immemorial. Phrases that, in Egyptian religious and historical language, often point to a deep mythic past beyond living memory. Think about that. If the Sphinx had been carved just 1,000 years earlier during Khafre's reign, Egypt would absolutely remember who built it. We're talking about a highly literate, record-obsessed civilization. They kept king lists. They preserved lineages. They carved temple walls with the names and deeds of rulers in excruciating detail. Yet by Thutmose's time, the Sphinx is treated like a mystery, an ancient guardian buried in sand, not a recent royal project, not a family statue, something older. And when you zoom out beyond just these two stelae, a pattern emerges. Across different periods of Egyptian history, the big monuments at Giza, the Sphinx and the pyramids, are consistently talked about in terms of restoration, cleaning, repairing, and excavating. Kings brag about digging them out, stabilizing them, honoring them, but never plainly say, "We built these." Now compare that to how Egyptians talk about everything else they build. They love to leave receipts. Temples like Karnak are overflowed with inscriptions bragging about which pharaoh added which hall, which gateway, which obelisk. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings are packed with texts, spells, prayers, maps of the afterlife, all customized for the individual buried there. Ramses II covers his temples with scenes of his victories. Even modest officials carve their titles and achievements on their own burial sites. Egyptian culture is not shy about saying, "I did this." So why? When it comes to the Great Pyramid, supposedly the greatest of all royal tombs, is there no construction inscription inside? No carved spell, no dedication, no text that clearly says, "This is a tomb of Khufu built by..." Just silence. Later graffiti and quarry marks near the top of the pyramid, discovered in the 19th century, are used as evidence that workers' gangs with names referencing Khufu built it. But even that is circumstantial, and it doesn't explain why the main internal spaces are completely bare, when even far smaller, less important tombs are covered in writing. It's a hole in the record where, based on everything we know about Egyptian behavior, you would absolutely expect to see information, a void where there should be certainty. And then, into that void, step the Inventory Stela and the Dream Stela, whispering the same thing in different ways. These structures were here before us. We dug them out. We fixed them. We used them. We revered them. But we did not make them. If you take those texts seriously, and remember they're Egyptian voices, not modern reinterpretations, then you start to see the Sphinx and the pyramids the way the pharaohs themselves might have. Not as their own creations, but as inheritances. Imagine being an Egyptian king walking onto the Giza plateau for the first time. You see a gigantic stone creature half buried in sand, its body scarred by ancient rains. You see titanic pyramids rising against the horizon, perfectly aligned, mathematically precise, already weathered. There are no living memories of who built them, no surviving plans. No clear instructions. What do? You treat them as sacred. You incorporate them into your religion. You build your own temples nearby. You carve your own texts in front of them. You restore where you can. You claim stewardship, not authorship. Over centuries, as later scribes try to tie everything together, the story blurs. Khufu becomes associated with the Great Pyramid because his name appears nearby. Khafre gets linked to the Sphinx because of stylistic similarities and proximity. Egyptologists, thousands of years later, look at this messy cluster of associations and try to flatten it into a clean who built what chart. But the stones, the erosion, and surviving Egyptian texts all point to a messier, older, deeper story. One where the Egyptians were not the first chapter, but one of the last. One where they encountered ruins. Yes, still functional, still imposing, still majestic, but ruins nonetheless. And they did what humans always do when faced with something ancient and powerful. They made it part of their world. If we listen not just to what modern scholars say about Egypt, but to what the Egyptians themselves preserved, their stele, their restoration records, their conspicuous silence about building Giza's core monuments, a different picture comes into focus. The Sphinx and the pyramids start to look less like 4th Dynasty projects and more like survivors from an earlier, forgotten age. Structures that were already mysterious, already partially buried, already worn down by forces that predate the desert itself. If that's true, then we've reached a critical next question. If the Egyptians didn't build these monuments, and if they treated them as inheritances, then what were those structures originally for? Because when you step inside the Great Pyramid, it doesn't feel like a tomb at all. So if the Egyptians inherited these monuments instead of building them from scratch, there's a question we can't avoid. What were they actually designed to do? To even begin answering that, we need to leave the sunlight and step inside the Great Pyramid itself. Not the tourist path, not the Instagram shot from outside. Inside, the original entrance is cramped, steep, and honestly kind of claustrophobic. You move hunched over, shuffling through a narrow corridor of limestone. The air cools as you go deeper. The outside world gets quieter until it's just your breathing and the echo of each step. And then, suddenly, the space opens up. You're standing at the bottom of the Grand Gallery. It's one of those places that, even if you've seen 1,000 photos, hits you completely differently when you imagine yourself there. The ceiling vaults up almost 30 feet. The walls are built with a corbel design, each layer of stone slightly overhanging the one below, creating this long, narrowing tunnel that seems to pull your gaze upward. Every stone block feels deliberate, cut with insane precision, aligned with such accuracy that you could believe this whole thing was machined rather than carved by hand thousands of years ago. And at the far end of this enormous sloping corridor, an opening leads into what we call the King's Chamber. Now, if this really was a royal tomb, this is the moment where you'd expect everything to scream afterlife at you. You'd expect walls covered in hieroglyphs, prayers to the gods, painted scenes of the pharaoh's journey through the underworld, protective spells from the Book of the Dead, sacred symbols, stars, deities, boats, serpents, the whole cosmic roadmap. But when you step into the King's Chamber, you get none of that. No inscriptions, no paintings, no prayers, no cartouches, not even a single carved symbol. Just smooth, reddish granite walls, a flat ceiling composed of massive slabs, a rectangular room that feels more like a device than a decorated tomb. And in the middle, that famous granite box. Most people call it a sarcophagus because that's what we're used to seeing in tombs. But if you really look at it, the story doesn't quite line up. The box has no lid. There's no sign it ever had one. No hinge points, no locking grooves, no broken edges where a lid would have been attached. The inside is rough and uneven, not polished or finished in the way you'd expect for the resting place of a god-king wrapped in sacred linens. There are no inscriptions on it, no carved spells, no names, no indication at all that it was meant to hold a royal body. And here's the kicker. The box is wider than the passages leading into the King's Chamber. In other words, you couldn't get it in there after the chamber was built. It's physically impossible to drag that thing through the corridors we use today. That means one of two things. Either the box was already there when the chamber was constructed around it, or it was carved inside the chamber from a larger block of granite. Either way, it's part of the architecture, an intentional component built into design from day one, not a later funerary object casually dropped in after completion. That's not how tombs normally work. In other royal burials, the sarcophagus is moved in before final sealing. It's not structurally baked into the building like a load-bearing element. Here, the box feels less like a coffin and more like a piece of equipment. And then there's the sound. If you ever heard recordings from inside the king's chamber, you know it has a strange, almost otherworldly quality. Researchers who studied its acoustics discovered that the room resonates strongly at around 110 hertz. That's not just some random number. When someone chants, sings, or plays a tone at around 110 hertz in that chamber, the sound doesn't just stay in the air, it vibrates through the stone. It reverberates in your chest. The whole room becomes a kind of resonant instrument. Modern studies of sound in the brain have found that frequencies in this range can influence human consciousness, nudging the brain toward meditative or trance-like states. So ask yourself, what kind of tomb is built to behave like a tuned acoustic chamber? The grand gallery itself amplifies and channels sound upward toward the king's chamber. Some researchers have suggested that the notches and niches along its walls may once have held wooden or metal components, resonators, beams, or devices that could vibrate at specific frequencies. That idea isn't proven, but the architecture absolutely feels like it was meant to shape something. Sound, energy, movement. It's functional in a way that has nothing to do with burial. Go one level down and the mystery deepens. Below the king's chamber is a so-called queen's chamber, another carefully constructed room that, again, contains no inscription, no mummy, no burial goods. What it does have are two narrow shafts that extend from its walls and don't reach the exterior. For years, these were dismissed as ventilation shafts or symbolic pathways for the pharaoh's soul. But that explanation doesn't fully work. They're sealed at both ends, and they're too small for any person to crawl through. When engineers measured their angles and directions, they made a startling discovery. The shafts aligned with specific stars, as they would have appeared thousands of years ago. The southern shaft from the Queen's chamber lines up with Sirius. The northern one points toward Thuban, the star that held the role of North Star in the distant past because of Earth's slow axial wobble precession. These are precise alignments. Not vague, close enough ones. If this was really just a tomb, why would it contain star-aligned shafts calculated with this level of astronomical accuracy? Why build sealed channels pointing at specific stars that shift over time, unless that precession, that slow, 26,000-year wobble of Earth, was part of the design? This is not the architecture of people fumbling randomly in the dark. It looks a lot more like the work of people who understood the sky deeply, not just symbolically, but scientifically. Now look at the material they chose for the king's chamber. Red granite from Aswan. Granite is full of quartz crystal. And quartz is piezoelectric, meaning it generates a tiny electrical charge when it's put under pressure. The king's chamber is made of massive granite blocks stacked under millions of tons of stone. Constant pressure, constant stress. Combine that with the room's resonant acoustics and its strange, tuned geometry, and you start to get a weird question creeping in from the edges. Was the Great Pyramid designed to manipulate more than just air and stone? Not electric power plant in the sci-fi sense, but some kind of energetic, acoustic, or electromagnetic phenomenon. A structure built to harness natural forces we don't fully understand yet. Most archaeologists shut down at this point. Too speculative. Too fringe. But the physical facts are what they are. The building is aligned to true north with mind-blowing precision, encoded with mathematical constants, resonant at specific frequencies, built with piezoelectric materials in key places, cut and placed with tolerances that rival modern engineering. That's odd if all you need is a giant royal grave. Now let's talk about the math. The ratio of the Great Pyramid's height to the perimeter of its base, when interpreted correctly, gives you pi, the fundamental constant governing circles and spheres. If you scale its dimensions by a factor of 43,200, you get near exact matches to Earth's radius and circumference. That number, 43,200, isn't random either. It's connected to ancient systems that encode the precession of the equinoxes, the same slow wobble we mentioned earlier with Thubin. In other words, the builders didn't just choose numbers that felt right. They chose proportions that seemed to reflect knowledge of the Earth as a globe, its size, its shape, and its relationship to the sky. The pyramid's base is oriented to true north with an accuracy within a small fraction of a degree, better than many modern structures, even with all our tech. To pull that off thousands of years ago requires careful observation of the heavens, long-term tracking of star positions, and refined surveying techniques. Then there's Phi, the golden ratio, woven into the pyramid geometry through its slope and relationships between height, half base, and face length. The king's chamber itself reflects harmonic ratios in its dimensions. Put this all together, and you get something that begins to look less like a tomb and more like a textbook written in stone. A physical encyclopedia of geometry, astronomy, and geodesy. A monument that encodes pi, phi, Earth's dimensions, precession, cardinal directions, harmonic frequencies, all in one structure. For a tomb, this is massive overkill. For a deliberately constructed message, or a device whose function depends on those exact relationships, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. Tombs are personal. They're full of identity, names, stories, treasures, prayers. The Great Pyramid is stripped of all that. No narrative, no ego, no explicit religion on its walls. Instead, it speaks in numbers, angles, proportions, alignments. That's not the language of a funerary chamber. That's the language of a blueprint. So the question that started as a little crack, are we sure this was just a tomb, starts opening wider and wider. Walk back out into the sun after being inside the Great Pyramid, and it's hard to see it the same way again. You're no longer looking at just a big pile of stone. You're looking at something that feels designed meticulously, purposefully designed to survive time itself, carry with it information that might only make sense to a civilization advanced enough to decode it. If it isn't a tomb, then what is it? An instrument? A resonant device? A geodetic marker? A time capsule? Whatever it is, one thing becomes clear. It wasn't built casually, and it wasn't built simply to house a dead body. And that brings us to another layer of the mystery, one that feels almost like the pyramid is teasing us. Because for all its precise geometry and obsessively careful construction, there are places inside it that are deliberately blocked off. Tiny shafts that end in sealed doors. Hidden voids that show up only on scans. And attempts to explore them that always seem to stop just short of answers. If the Great Pyramid is not just a tomb, if it's a kind of machine, a resonant structure, a blueprint written in stone, then there's a question that should be burning in your mind. What else is inside it? For a long time, the consensus was, we've already mapped everything. 3 main chambers, a few connecting passageways. That's it. Mystery solved. But the pyramid had other plans. In the 1990s, a small robot crawled into a space no human could fit, and what it found blew open the idea that we already knew what was inside. Let's go back to that moment. Deep inside the Great Pyramid is the so-called Queen's Chamber. From its walls extend 2 narrow shafts, one to the north, one to the south. They're tiny, about 8 inches square. Too small for a person. Too tight even for most animals. For decades, they were dismissed as symbolic, with labels like air shafts or soul passages. There was just one problem. They didn't behave like air shafts. They didn't reach the outside. They weren't open. They were sealed. So, what's the point of building a vent that doesn't vent anything? In 1993, a German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink decided to stop guessing and actually look. He designed a small robotic crawler with lights and a camera, a little mechanical scout he named Up-You-Out, after the ancient Egyptian god who opens the way. Its mission, explore the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber. On March 22nd, 1993, Up-You-Out rolled into the darkness. The shaft climbed upward at a steep angle, squeezing to the core of the pyramid. On the monitors outside, engineers watched as the robot crawled along smooth limestone walls, bumping over tiny irregularities, inching forward into a space no human had ever seen. Meter after meter, stone after stone, the shaft just kept going. And then, about 65 meters in, it stopped, not because the robot failed, because it hit something. Blocking the shaft was a small, polished piece of limestone set perfectly into the passage, like a tiny door. It fit so snugly you could barely see the outline around it. And embedded into its surface were two tiny copper handles, like pins or knobs. This wasn't rubble. It wasn't a natural block. It was planned, engineered, a deliberate barrier placed at the end of a tunnel designed too small for any human to enter. And that raises a question that still hangs over this mystery like a dark cloud. If no person was ever meant to go into that shaft, who or what was this door meant to block? The discovery caused a stir. If the pyramid was just a tomb, why would its builders go to the trouble of carving a narrow, angled passage from a chamber, aim it carefully through the structure, and then seal it with a door nobody could ever physically reach? What purpose does that serve? For almost a decade, the mystery sat there. Gannon Brink's robot had shown the world the door, but nobody was allowed to go further. Permits stalled. Access was delayed. Egypt's antiquities authorities gave vague explanations. Finally, in 2002, a live TV event was organized. A new drill-equipped robot was sent into the shaft, and the world watched as the tiny camera moved toward the mysterious limestone block. We were finally going to see what was behind the door. The drill word. A small hole was cut through the stone. The camera slid forward, peering through the opening. On the other side, for a breathless moment, everyone expected something. A chamber, a hollow, an inscription, anything. Instead, the lens focused on another smooth stone surface. A second door, barely a few inches beyond the first. No chamber, no big reveal, just another barrier. And then the broadcast ended. Officially, the explanation was, we don't know what's behind the second door yet. We'll need more study, more planning. We'll get to it. But years passed. Access tightened again. The shafts remained sealed. No major follow-up investigation was allowed. The second door is still there today, untouched. It's hard not to feel like the pyramid is trolling us at this point. The northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber tells a similar story. Explorers sent tools into it, found another strange obstruction, a metal object embedded in the stone. And then once again, everything slowed down, access restricted, questions unanswered. The more we look, the more the pyramid starts to feel like an intentional puzzle, like its builders wanted someone someday to find these things, but only when that someone had reached a certain level of technology and understanding. Now, these aren't the only hidden spaces. Radar and muon scans, imaging techniques that let us see density changes inside stone, have revealed anomalies throughout the Great Pyramid. Voids, cavities, hollow regions where, according to the simple solid stack of blocks model, there shouldn't be anything. In recent years, one of these voids, a large, unexplained space above the Grand Gallery, made headlines. It's big, comparable in size to the gallery itself. It doesn't match any known chamber or passage. Its purpose? Unknown. Access? Not granted. Other scans have hinted at possible hollows below the King's Chamber. Again, no excavation, no cameras, just data, then silence. And this pattern doesn't stop with the pyramid. Beneath the Giza plateau itself, things get even stranger. Near the causeway linking the pyramids and the Sphinx, there's a vertical shaft plunging down into the bedrock. Today, we call it the Osiris shaft. To reach the bottom, you descend through multiple levels, like going down a stone elevator shaft carved by a civilization with unlimited patience and no fear of tight spaces. The first level has small niches. The second level branches into small side chambers. Finally, you reach a third level, filled partially with water, where a large granite sarcophagus sits surrounded by smaller carved spaces. All of this is carved directly into the rock. No loose blocks, no simple trenches. It's as if someone drilled straight down into the plateau and built a multi-story underground complex. The official line is a symbolic tomb, a cenotaph dedicated to the god Osiris. But that explanation doesn't really address the engineering involved. Cutting a straight, deep shaft through solid limestone and granite, managing groundwater, carving chambers at multiple depths, lifting and placing a massive granite coffin in the lowest chamber, all in pitch blackness, with limited ventilation thousands of years ago. Meanwhile, radiocarbon dating of materials found inside suggests that parts of this structure may predate the 4th dynasty, just like the Sphinx. So now we have a Sphinx that looks geologically older than Egypt, a pyramid that behaves more like a machine than a tomb, a subterranean shaft that may be older than the pyramids, chambers and voids inside the pyramid that no one is allowed to explore, sealed doors inside tiny shafts that no human could ever use. And we're supposed to believe this is all just standard pharaonic funerary architecture. It gets even more unsettling when you look at what's beneath the Sphinx. Ground-penetrating radar and seismographic surveys around the monument have detected anomalies, cavities and voids beneath its paws and along its body. One study in the 1990s suggested a sizable rectangular chamber right under the front of the Sphinx. You'd think that would be the kind of discovery archaeologists dream about. Hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx is the kind of headline that funds research for decades. But instead of a full-scale push to investigate, we got restrictions, areas fenced off, permits denied, explanations vague or ongoing. If all these hidden spaces, doors, and voids turned out to be nothing, just natural pockets, collapsed stone, or structural leftovers, you could solve the mystery and shut the fringe theories down forever by simply exploring them properly and publishing the results. But that's not what happens. Instead, the closer we get to something that might fundamentally change the story, the more the shutters come down. This is where the narrative starts to feel less like we just don't know yet, and more like we're not allowed to know. Let's be clear. This doesn't automatically mean there's some secret society hoarding lost technology in a hidden basement under Giza. It could be politics. It could be academic turf wars. It could be a simple, very human fear of overturning careers and textbooks built on the current model. But regardless of the reason, the effect is the same. The pyramid is still hiding things. The Sphinx is still hiding things. And the people with the power to look aren't really looking. Or if they are, they're not telling us what they find. So we're left with a structure built with absurd precision, encoding sophisticated math, aligned to the stars, filled with sealed shafts and unexplored voids. A Sphinx weathered by rains from a different world. Subterranean complexes that might be older than the civilization that supposedly built them. And over, we see the same pattern. Hidden, sealed, restricted, explained away. At some point you have to ask, what were these people trying to preserve? Because if these aren't tombs, if these shafts and chambers and doors aren't about guarding mummies and treasure, maybe they're guarding something else. Not gold, not bodies. Something more valuable. Knowledge, blueprints, evidence of a culture that knew collapse was coming and decided in code what they could in the only thing that would survive long enough for someone like us to find it. Stone. And if that's true at Giza, then we have to ask a much bigger question. Is this pattern unique to Egypt? Or are there other places on Earth where we see the same signature? Ancient structures that are too old, too precise, too advanced for the civilizations we say built them? Because once you start looking beyond the Nile, you find out something unnerving. Giza's not alone. If the pyramids are relics of forgotten age, if the Sphinx remembers a climate we've erased from our textbooks, if sealed doors and hidden voids hint at knowledge deliberately locked away, then we have to ask, is this just an Egyptian anomaly? Or is this part of something much bigger, a pattern that stretches across the ancient world? Once you stop treating Giza as an isolated miracle and start scanning the globe for similar fingerprints, something unsettling emerges. You start seeing the same themes over and over. Structures that are far older than they're supposed to be. Stones move and carve with techniques we don't fully understand. Mathematical and astronomical precision that doesn't match the level of primitive cultures we've assigned to those dates. Sites that seem deliberately buried, sealed, or left behind as if someone wanted them to survive long after everything else was gone. In other words, Giza isn't exception. It might be the centerpiece of a worldwide pattern. Let's start in a place that, until recently, nobody thought could even exist. Southeastern Turkey. On a lonely hilltop, called Göbekli Tepe. If you dropped the civilization timeline on the table and pointed at 12,000 years ago, most historians would say, right here, people are still hunter-gatherers. Small bands. No cities, no massive temples, no advanced architecture. Just basic tools and campfires. And then Göbekli Tepe walked into the room and flipped the table. This site is currently dated to around 10,000 BC, roughly 12,000 years old. That means it's older than Stonehenge by about 7,000 years, older than the pyramids by at least 6,000, older than pottery, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than pretty much everything that we say civilization depends on. And yet, there on that hill, someone created a complex of stone circles anchored by massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 10 tons or more. These pillars are not crude. They're carved. They're decorated with animals, symbols, abstract shapes, and humanoid figures. The artwork is sophisticated. The stones are quarried and transported with intent and organization. This isn't a random pile of rocks. It's architecture. And here's the detail that really messes with the standard story. The people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't supposed to have the social structure necessary to do this. If you go by the textbook model, monumental architecture comes after agriculture, surplus, specialization, and hierarchical societies. You need farmers to produce extra food. You need leaders to organize labor. You need settled villages to anchor big projects. But Göbekli Tepe appears to have been built before widespread agriculture in that region. In other words, hunter-gatherers, the people we label as simple and nomadic, pulled off a feat of construction that looks like it belongs to a much later, more developed era. Either the timeline is wrong, or we've been vastly underestimating what so-called primitive cultures were capable of. And just when you think it can't get weirder, it does. Because after building these stone circles, carving these pillars, arranging them with care, somebody buried them. Not buried by time or random sediment. Deliberately filled in. Circle after circle was entombed under layers of backfill, as if the builders wanted to preserve them, not for their own use, but for someone in the future. Sound familiar? Think of the hidden voids at Giza, the sealed shafts, the doors no human can reach. The feeling that these sites were designed not just to function in their own time, but to communicate across vast stretches of history. Göbekli Tepe fits that pattern disturbingly well. Now let's move west to Lebanon, to a place called Baalbek. Most tourists go there to see the Roman temples. They're impressive, towering columns, grand courtyards, intricate reliefs. But we're not here for the Roman work. We're here for what's under it. In the foundation of one of those temples lies the trilithon, 3 enormous stone blocks forming part of a platform wall. Each block weighs around 800 to 1,000 tons. To put that in perspective, many modern cranes max out a fraction of that. These stones aren't just huge. They're precise, cut cleanly, set into place 20 feet above ground level, fitted tightly, with gaps so thin you'd struggle to push a knife blade between them. The Romans built brilliantly, and they left behind detailed records of their engineering feats. Aqueducts, bridges, amphitheaters. But they never claimed these particular stones. The trilithon is just there, already in place when they arrived. So they built on top of it, as if they were inheriting a foundation from an earlier civilization. A short distance away, in an ancient quarry, lies an even bigger clue. The so-called stone of the pregnant woman, an unfinished block still attached to bedrock. It's estimated to weigh around 1,200 tons. Who started cutting that? What method did they plan to use to move it? And why did they stop? No text explains it. No inscription says, "We did this." It just sits there, like a frozen half-sentence from a vanished language of stone. Now we go to South America. High on the Bolivian Altiplano, near Lake Titicaca, is a site called Pumapunku. If Baalbek's mystery is size, Pumapunku's is precision. Here, massive blocks of andesite and diorite, stone so hard they challenge modern steel tools, have been carved with almost machine-like accuracy. We're talking surfaces that are nearly perfectly flat, edges that form razor-sharp right angles, complex interlocking shapes that fit together like pieces of a 3D puzzle. Repeated cuts and grooves that look as if they were made with standardized tools or templates. Some stones feature deep channels and inset H shapes that seem engineered for assembly, as if they were meant to lock into other blocks in specific ways. The culture usually credited with Pumapunku, the Tiwanaku, had no recorded use of iron or steel, no evidence of advanced machinery, no writing system we can read. Yet the stonework suggests a level of control and consistency that our own stonemasons struggle to replicate using Bronze Age tools. When modern craftsmen attempt to recreate Pumapunku style cuts using traditional techniques, they can get close, but not that close. The margins of error at the original site are so tight that they push the boundaries of what's realistically doable with simple hammer and chisel methods. Again, we're faced with a choice. Either there were techniques and tools that we haven't discovered or acknowledged, or the people we attribute this work to weren't the ones who originally did it, like Giza, like Baalbek, like Göbekli Tepe. Now, let's head to the Mediterranean, to the island of Malta. Beneath its surface is a labyrinth called the Hypogeum, an underground temple complex carved out of limestone over 5,000 years ago. It's a maze of chambers, alcoves, and passages, all cut directly from solid rock. The architecture mimics above-ground temple forms, pillars, doorways, and curved ceilings, but in a subterranean environment. The deeper you go, the stranger it gets. In one particular room, known as the Oracle Chamber, something very familiar happens. If someone speaks or chants at certain pitches, the chamber starts to resonate, strongly, at around 110 hertz. The same frequency we saw in the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid. Stand in that room while a tone at 110 hertz is sustained, and you feel it in your body. The sound vibrates your chest, your skull, your bones. It's not just hearing, it's experiencing. That is not an accident. The Hypogeum's builders clearly understood how to shape stone to produce resonance. They carved the room deliberately to tune it. So now we have an underground temple in Malta resonating at 110 hertz, a granite chamber in the Great Pyramid resonating at 110 hertz, both structures thousands of miles apart, separated by cultures and oceans. Two different societies, possibly separated by thousands of years, using the same acoustic trick in stone chambers. Why? For ritual? For healing? For altering consciousness? For something more technical? We don't know, but we can recognize the pattern. Acoustic tuning, mathematical precision, astronomical alignment, massive stonework pushed to extreme limits. And these sites, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Pumapunku, the Hypogeum, are just a sample. We see similar patterns in the massive megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, with their gigantic interlocking stones. The submerged structures off the coast of Japan, like Yonaguni, that some researchers argue were carved before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. The stone spheres of Costa Rica, carved with surprising geometric accuracy. The dolmens of Korea. The standing stones of Karnak in France. The temples and megaliths of Malta above ground. Everywhere you look, you find anomalies. Stones that are too large, cuts that are too perfect, alignments that are too precise, dates that are too early for the level of sophistication involved. Taken one at a time, each site can be brushed off as a curiosity, a coincidence, a we don't quite know but whatever, but put them together and the picture changes. You start to see a global fingerprint, a signature of knowledge, a way of building with stone, math, and the sky that appears in multiple places, often at the very edges or well before the timelines of the civilizations we credit. It looks less like isolated bursts of genius and more like the fading echoes of a once widespread capability, a skill set, a tradition, a memory. And if that's true, if these are not one-offs but connected hints of a lost chapter in human history, then the next question is obvious. Who were the people behind this? Where did they come from? And if they were that advanced, what happened to them? If a global culture once existed, one capable of building things like Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Pumapunku, and the pyramids, then there's a brutal, simple question. Where are they? Where are their cities, their tools, their everyday artifacts? Where are the cemeteries, the skeletons, the unmistakable footprint of their existence. For a long time, that was the ultimate checkmate argument from mainstream archaeology. Show us the people. Show us their bones. Show us their settlements. If you can't, this lost civilization idea is just a story. And for decades, we couldn't. The stones were there, but the builders seemed to have vanished without a trace. Like a movie where someone erased a cast and left only the sets behind. But then, a new kind of science quietly arrived in the background. A science that doesn't need whole cities or intact skeletons. A science that can detect ancient peoples even when their bones have crumbled to dust, their stories have been forgotten, and their artifacts are scattered or destroyed. That science is archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, and it has revealed something nobody was expecting. Entire populations that once existed and then disappeared. People who left no written record, no clear archaeological culture, no monuments we can confidently tie to their name, but who still live on invisibly inside us. We call them ghost populations. A ghost population isn't a supernatural thing. It's a statistical one. Imagine geneticists take DNA from ancient skeletons in a region and from modern people living there today. They compare them and build a kind of family tree. Who descended from whom, who mixed with whom, where migrations happened. Most of the time, the data fits into known histories. This group came from here. That group migrated from there. But sometimes there's a glitch. You see a pattern of ancestry that doesn't match anything we know. Not from Africa, not from Europe, not from Asia, not from any labeled, identified population. It's like finding fingerprints all over a room from someone whose identity has been erased from every database. You can't see them directly. You only see their traces in the DNA of later groups. That's a ghost population. One of the first big ones was discovered in 2016. Researchers were studying DNA from early farmers in the Near East. The people who, as far as we know, invented agriculture and kicked off the whole civilization experiment in that region. When they ran the numbers, they found something strange. A chunk of ancestry in these early farmers that didn't correspond to any known group. It wasn't from the African lineages we recognized. It wasn't from European hunter-gatherers. It wasn't from East Asians. It was something else. Something older. They called this mysterious lineage Beta Eurasians. These people seem to have split off from all the other non-African humans very early. So early that they don't even carry Neanderthal DNA, which almost all other non-African populations have. In other words, they were a distinct, ancient branch of humanity that lived, thrived, and contributed to later populations. But we've never found their bones in a way we can clearly identify. We have no idea what they called themselves. No cities we can confidently attribute to them. No pottery style we can point at and say, that's basal Eurasian. And yet, their genes are still here, like a ghostly watermark in the DNA of people who came after them. And they're not alone. The deeper geneticists look, the more ghost populations they find. In Africa, multiple extinct human groups that contributed to modern populations but left no recognized fossils. In Southeast Asia, unknown archaic humans who mixed with early modern humans, then vanished. In Europe, lineages that appear in ancient genomes for a brief window, then disappear, replaced or absorbed by later migrations. Nowhere is this more relevant to our story than North Africa, because North Africa is where the Sphinx stands. It's where Sahara once bloomed as a green, fertile landscape, and it's where genetic data shows something very, very interesting. Ancient DNA from North Africa reveals a rich, complex mix of ancestries, some related to Near East, some to Sub-Saharan Africa, some to Europe, and some that don't cleanly map to anywhere, traces of populations that simply don't exist anymore. During the African humid period, when the Sahara wasn't a desert but a lush region of lakes, rivers, and grasslands, these now vanished groups lived there. They thrived. They adapted to a world that looked nothing like the endless sand we see today. They left rock art, carvings and paintings of boats, cattle, wildlife, and even what looked like ritual scenes, in places that are now among the driest on Earth. Then, as the climate shifted around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago and the Sahara dried out, everything changed. Some of these people moved south. merging with sub-Saharan populations. Some moved north and east, leaving their genetic fingerprints in Mediterranean and Near Eastern groups. But the core populations that once lived in the heart of the Green Sahara seem to vanish from the record. Their cultures collapse or scatter. Their languages are gone. Their names are gone. Their stories are gone. All that remains are faint signatures in DNA. Echoes in the genes of modern people who don't even know they carry the legacy of a lost world. So now let's connect the dots. We have a Sahara that used to be green, full of water and life. Ghost populations who lived there during that fertile window. Rock art, megaliths, and ancient sites in what are now remote desert regions. Geological evidence that the Sphinx was carved and eroded by rain during that same wet period. Is it really that far-fetched to think that some of these ghost populations, these forgotten North African cultures, might have been the ones who carved the Sphinx? Maybe even the ones who began a tradition of stonework, astronomy, and geometry that would later echo in places like Giza, Göbekli Tepe, and beyond? This doesn't mean a global sci-fi super-civilization with flying machines and laser tools. It means something more subtle and in some ways more disturbing. Human societies far earlier than we thought possible, achieving levels of knowledge and coordination we've only been willing to attribute to much later cultures. And then losing it, not once, maybe multiple times. Because there's another layer to this story. Climate catastrophe. Around 12,900 years ago, something dramatic happened to Earth's climate. Temperatures plunged. Glaciers surged. Ecosystems collapsed. This period is known as the Younger Dryas. It was like a sudden, brutal relapse into Ice Age conditions, just when things were warming up. Within a human lifetime, the environment in many regions became harsher, colder, and far less stable. There's still debate over what caused it. Some scientists argue for shifts in ocean currents. Others see evidence for a massive cosmic impact. Fragment of comet or asteroid slamming into the planet, igniting wildfires, throwing dust into the atmosphere, and triggering a chain reaction of climate chaos. Whatever the cause, the impact on humans was enormous. Populations crashed. Places that have been habitable for thousands of years became barren or dangerous. If any advanced culture existed before or during this period, a culture with complex architecture, astronomy, and engineering, it would have been hit hard. Imagine, coastal cities drowned, the sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Inland settlements buried under sediment, sand, or jungle. Survivors forced to migrate, leaving behind monuments, but losing technologies they could no longer maintain. Within a few generations, the stories of what came before could easily fragment into myths. Tales of a golden age, of people who knew more, who built more, who fell in some great catastrophe. Flood myths, sky fire myths, stories of a time before the waters rose, or before the world froze. Now add the ghost populations into this. We know there were large, ancient groups whose identities have vanished, but whose genes live on. We know there were dramatic climate events that could wipe out entire cultures. We know there are ancient structures, the Sphinx, Göbekli Tepe, certain megaliths in the Sahara and elsewhere that appeared just before or after these climatic turning points, carrying a level of sophistication that textbook history struggles to explain. It's not hard to imagine a scenario like this. A culture or network of cultures slowly advances during a relatively stable period after the last glacial maximum. They learn the sky. They map the earth. They develop techniques for working stone with precision we struggle to match. They build monuments designed not for decoration, but for endurance. Then the Younger Dryas hits. Climate chaos, disaster, floods, droughts, crop failures, collapsing ecosystems. Populations fragment. Some die, some migrate, some cling on in pockets. Their cities, if they had them, might now be underwater or buried. Their texts, if they wrote any, rot away. Their language dissolves in the mouths of descendants who only half remember what came before. But what to survive? The stones, the structures, the things they built specifically to outlast catastrophe. Like a sphinx carved from bedrock, like pyramids structured in code math and aligned with stars, like pillars buried on purpose under hills of earth. like megalithic foundations adopted by later cultures who said, "We found this, we built on it." We don't actually know who started it. So when geneticists talk about ghost populations, when they say, "We see people in the data who no longer exist as distinct cultures," it changes the tone of this whole conversation. Because now, instead of saying, "There's no evidence of older advanced peoples," we have to say, "Their bodies are gone, their cities may be gone, but their genes are still here, and their stones are still standing. We are their descendants. We carry their DNA. We stand in front of the monuments they left behind and insist those monuments must belong to the younger civilizations we can see clearly, because we're not used to looking deeper in time. But the evidence in rock, in climate, in genetics is starting to converge on something that sounds very much like the story the pyramids themselves might be trying to tell us. We are not the first. We rose before. We fell. We left messages in stone. And now, as we reach a similar level of complexity and face our own climate warnings, we're finally advanced enough to read those messages. The question is, will we listen? Because if the pyramids and Sphinx are relics of a forgotten age, if global megaliths and ghost populations are the scattered fingerprints of that story, then the next step is the most profound of all. What if these structures weren't just built by a lost civilization, but were built for the future? For us. If all of this is true, the geology, the inscriptions, the anomalous engineering, the ghost populations, the global pattern, then the question that started as, what if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, evolves into something much deeper? What were these structures for? Because everything we've seen suggests they weren't built for the people who claimed them. Not really. Not in the way we've been taught. They weren't built as vanity projects for kings. They weren't built as simple tombs full of treasures and funerary texts. They were built for something far more profound. They were built as memory. Not memory in the way we think of a statue or a portrait. In loving remembrance of so-and-so. Not a plaque that says, "On this spot, this event happened." I'm talking about memory in the raw, essential sense. The deliberate preservation of knowledge across disaster, across collapse, across the ending of a world. A way of saying, this is what we learned, this is what we knew, please don't let it die with us. And the medium they chose for that memory wasn't scrolls or books or digital files. It was stone. Look at what the Great Pyramid actually contains. Not in its chambers, in its design. Its dimensions, when scaled correctly, echo the dimensions of the Earth. Its height and base perimeter encode pi. Its geometry reflects phi, the golden ratio, woven into its slope and proportions. Its orientation locks onto true north with precision that demands repeated, careful sky watching. The shafts point toward specific stars as they appeared thousands of years ago, linking the structure not only to Earth's geography, but to its position within the wider cosmos, and to the slow precessional wobble of the planet's axis over 25,920 years. That is not decoration. That is data. The pyramid is a three-dimensional library of measurements. The shape and size of Earth. The relationship between circles, spheres, and straight lines. The movements of stars and the precession of the equinoxes. The cardinal directions of the planet itself. It encodes stable truths. Things that don't depend on culture or language. Things any advanced civilization at any time can test and verify. Why would someone do that? Why build a monument that quietly encodes astronomy, geometry, and geodesy in its very bones? Why use a medium as insanely durable as millions of tons of fitted stone, unless you're trying to send a message that can survive almost anything? Think about how fragile normal civilization is. Scrolls burn, books rot, hard drive corrupt, cloud servers sound permanent, but they're one power failure, one war, one solar flare away from oblivion. Even languages themselves decay. Give 1,000 years, and the words you're hearing right now would sound like a foreign tongue. But mathematics? Mathematics doesn't care. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is the same no matter who calculates it. The length of Earth's radius will be the same for any creature capable of measuring it. The wobble of the planet's axis will still be 25,920 years no matter who tracks it. If you wanted to write a message that could survive not just time, but the death of your entire culture, you wouldn't write it in your own language. You'd write it in the universes. You'd write it in math. And you need a medium tough enough to carry that message across millennia of storms, quakes, wars, floods, erosion, and human forgetfulness. Stone. Now take that idea and apply it to the pyramid. We've been trying to read it as a story. Who is buried here? What king does it belong to? But what if it was never meant to be a biography? What if it's more like an equation carved into the landscape? A permanent proof. A demonstration. We were here. We knew this. The world is a shape, this size, in the sky. We can measure it. So can you. It's not aimed at gods. It's aimed at us. At whoever would rise again after the dust settled and the world rebuilt itself. The sealed doors, the hidden chambers, the silence inside the structure. All of that starts to look different if you think of the pyramid as a test. Almost like the builders were saying. If you can't even find these passages, if you can't even detect these voids, if you can't decode the geometry we used, then you're not ready for what we put inside. They didn't write instructions on the outside because they didn't care about quick answers. They cared about whether a future civilization could reach the level necessary to notice the questions at all. The math and astronomy encoded in the pyramid's proportions might be the first layer, a way of checking. Have they figured out their planet? Have they mapped their sky? Have they learned to think beyond survival and into abstraction? Only then would they be ready to go deeper, into the sealed shafts, the hidden chambers, the places we keep discovering, then politely ignoring. If you think of it that way, the Great Pyramid stops being a tomb and starts looking more like a time capsule, or a vault, or even a kind of cosmic memory drive. And if that's true at Giza, the pattern we see around the world takes on a new meaning. Göbekli Tepe, buried on purpose. Stone circles filled in and preserved under layers of earth. Baalbek's trilithon. Impossible stones forming a foundation so robust that later cultures could build on top of it without even understanding who laid it. The hypogeum in Malta and the King's Chamber in Giza, both tuned to the same resonant frequency, hinting at a shared understanding of how sound interacts with human consciousness and stone. Pumapunku's incredibly precise blocks, like components of a system we no longer know how to assemble, taken together. These sites stop looking like random anomalies and start looking like nodes, points in a global network built around the same core idea. Preserve what matters. Encode it in ways that don't depend on fragile media. Use stone. Use geometry. Use the sky. Distribute it widely, so if one region falls, others might survive. In other words, don't trust the continuity of any single civilization. Trust the continuity of the planet itself. Place your memory in alignments with stars, in ratios reflecting Earth's shape, in resonance with frequencies tied to human biology. Things that anyone, at any time, with enough curiosity and intelligence, could rediscover. Because here's the brutal truth. Civilizations fall, not just once, not just in the distant past, over and over. Climate changes, volcanoes erupt, seas rise, meteorites hit, empires overextend and collapse, knowledge is hoarded and then burned, libraries go up in flames. Oral traditions are broken when the last storyteller dies. From the point of view of someone thinking in thousands of years, human civilization isn't a straight line. It's a heartbeat, pulse, rise, peak, crash. Then, centuries later, a new rise, new languages, new gods. The old stories chopped up into myths, legends, fairy tales. Imagine a culture that has seen this cycle more than once. Not just a few years of famine or a single failed dynasty, but full-on collapse. Coastlines redrawn, climates altered, population bottlenecks where 90% of humans die or scatter. If they were wise, they wouldn't just build monuments to themselves. They'd build monuments to their knowledge. They'd ask, what do we wish we'd known the last time civilization fell? Then they'd carve the answers in a form capable of outlasting them. That's what the pyramids start to look like, once you pull back far enough. Not symbols of arrogance, but of humility. A culture admitting, we are not permanent, but maybe what we've learned can be. And here's where this stops being just an archaeological curiosity and becomes uncomfortably relevant. Because for the first time since those ancient builders looked up at the sky and measured their world, we're at a similar point, a global civilization, highly interconnected, technologically advanced, capable of extraordinary creation and extraordinary self-destruction. We're playing with climate, energy, war, AI, biotech, levers that can twist the entire planet in a single human lifetime. The ancients left messages in stone, quietly saying, "We were here. We knew things. We fell. Don't make our mistakes." The real question is, are we going to treat their monuments as tourist attractions or as warnings? Because if the pyramids are memory, if they're a message from one cycle of civilization to the next, then we're standing in exactly the position they were built for. We are the future they were speaking to, the descendants of survivors, the ones who finally climbed far enough back up the ladder to understand what they tried to say. And the next step in this journey is to ask, if they built for us, what exactly were they trying to get us to remember? If the pyramids are memory carved in stone, there's a second half to that idea we haven't fully faced yet. Stone lasts. Words don't. And when you look at history through that lens, you start to see just how fragile our version of the past really is. We like to imagine that if a great civilization existed, we have shelves of their books, piles of their scrolls, endless written records spelling everything out. But ask yourself, how much of our knowledge would survive 10,000 years of chaos, floods, wars, and neglect? Not the paper, not the drives, not the servers. What you'd be left with are ruins and rumors, and maybe, if you're lucky, a few scraps of text that slipped through the cracks and somehow didn't burn. There's one particular story that captures this perfectly, a story about a manuscript that almost changed everything and then vanished. In the 1800s, when European collectors were swarming Egypt hunting for artifacts, they weren't just after statues and sarcophagi. They were raiding libraries, monasteries, private collections, anywhere old manuscripts might be hiding. Some of the most interesting texts weren't hieroglyphs on temple walls. They were Coptic Christian writings, documents copied and preserved by Egyptian monks long after the pharaohs were gone. These monks sometimes acted as bridges between eras. Their libraries didn't only contain Christian theology. They also preserved older material, translating or copying texts that reached back to the Greco-Roman period, and sometimes, if you believe the whispers, into far older traditions. According to multiple second-hand accounts, one such manuscript was found in a Coptic monastery near Cairo. The text itself eventually vanished, destroyed, or hidden. So everything we know comes from notes, letters, and partial translations recorded by people who claim to have seen it. What they described as simple, but explosive. The manuscript referenced the pyramids, not as recent pharaonic constructions, but as structures built before words, before writing even existed, and before the river knew its place. That last phrase is the one that sticks in your mind. Before the river knew its place. If you strip away the poetry, what does that mean? It sounds like a reference to a time before the Nile settled into its current course. A time when the entire region's river systems were different, when the landscape itself hadn't yet taken the shape we recognize today. Geology tells us that North Africa went through huge climatic and hydrological shifts at the end of the last ice age and into the African humid period. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Rivers shifted. The Nile's flow changed. So this manuscript, if accurately reported, was saying the pyramids were built before that, before the Nile we know, before the climate we know, before writing. That puts them squarely in the same impossible time frame as Göbekli Tepe and the Green Sahara. When the collector who supposedly acquired this manuscript realized what he was reading, he made notes, tried to translate key passages, and showed it to colleagues. Some dismissed it outright. Too strange. Too mythic. Others thought it might be a distorted echo of older traditions. But before anyone could photograph it, catalog it properly, or subject it to serious study, the manuscript was gone. Depending on which account you read, it was lost in a fire at the collector's home, sold to a private buyer and never seen again, destroyed deliberately by someone who understood just how controversial its contents were. We don't know which version is true. We just know it's gone. All that remains are those chilling phrases, preserved in letters and second-hand notes. Before words, before the river knew its place. Skeptics argue. So what? It was probably a medieval fantasy text. People make things up all the time. And that's fair. Forgeries exist. Embellishment exists. Monks wrote allegory, myth, and symbolic religious stories that were never meant as literal history. But if it was just a pious myth, why destroy it? Why not file it under interesting but apocryphal and move on? Forged or not, texts like that are usually archived, studied as windows into the beliefs of the people who created them. They're not treated like hazardous material that must be erased. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable. The content described in that manuscript lines up disturbingly well with evidence we've only uncovered recently. In the 19th century, nobody had climate data showing how and when North Africa changed from wet to dry. Nobody was talking about precession in connection with ancient monuments. Nobody had excavated Göbekli Tepe. Nobody had ground-penetrating radar, revealing buried riverbeds under the Sahara. Yet this text was supposedly already saying, the pyramids come from a time before writing. They were built before the Nile settled into its modern course. That doesn't prove the manuscript was ancient or accurate, but it's enough to make you wonder, how many times has someone stumbled onto a piece of the truth, only for it to vanish in fire, flood, war, or because it was just too disruptive? Think of how much we've already lost that we know about. The Library of Alexandria, with its scrolls from across the ancient world. The archives of temple complexes like Heliopolis, destroyed, scattered, or reused as building material. Entire civilizations whose writing we still can't read. The Indus-script, linear countless lost languages of Africa, the Americas, Oceania. Most of human history was never written down. Of the part that was most is rotted, burned, or been erased. What's left is a thin, ragged film of text floating over an ocean of silence. And every once in a while, we catch a glimpse of what slipped below the surface, a mention of a lost book, a destroyed scroll, an obliterated temple archive, a phantom manuscript that claimed the pyramids were older than the river itself. Then it's gone again. This is exactly the problem a civilization would be trying to solve if it decided to encode its knowledge in stone instead. They'd know texts can be censored, archives can be burned, conquerors can rewrite history. But a 6 million ton pyramid aligned to the stars in the cardinal directions? Good luck censoring that. You can misinterpret it. You can ignore it. You can slap a tourist sign on it and say, Tomb, 4th Dynasty, move along. But you can't unbuild it. You can't delete its math. You can't erase the geological reality of the Sphinx's water erosion. The stones don't care what story we prefer. They're still telling their own. The lost Coptic manuscript, whether genuinely ancient, a medieval echo of older traditions, or even a later myth, still serves as a perfect example of why stone outlives ink. Because now we have a situation like this. A monument that screams, I'm older than you think, through geology and math. Ancient Egyptian texts that hint the pyramids and Sphinx were restorations, not original builds. Ghost populations in the DNA, proving people existed in the right place and time to be the true builders. Global anomalies that suggest some shared, older knowledge base. And written records that could tie it all together. Missing, burned, or dismissed. What survives consistently? The stone, the erosion, the geometry, the alignments. It's almost as if the builders looked at the future, at us, and said, they will lose our words. They will lose our names. Their historians will argue endlessly based on incomplete records. So we're not going to trust paper. We're not going to trust language. We're going to trust physics. We're going to trust that whoever comes after us, if they get far enough, will rediscover the same constants, the same sky, the same earth. And when they do, they'll look at what we built and realize, these people knew what we know, maybe more. The burned manuscript is tragic, but in a way, it proves the builders right. Words can be destroyed. Stone cannot. At least, not easily, not completely. So when we stand at Giza today, we're seeing what didn't burn, what survived all the wars and fires and floods and kings and collapses. We're looking at a medium that outlasted not just one culture, but multiple cycles of human civilization. And that brings us to a sobering thought. If our own world were to collapse tomorrow, if our digital cloud turned to silence, if our libraries burned, our cities fell, our languages fractured, what would we leave behind that could speak for us 10,000 years from now? What have we built that could do for a future civilization what the pyramids, the Sphinx, and Göbekli Tepe might be doing for us now? Because whether we want to admit it or not, we're in the same position those ancient builders were in. We've climbed incredibly high. We're playing with forces nuclear, climatic, biological, technological, that can shape or shatter the entire planet. And deep down, we know we are not guaranteed to stay at this height. So as we begin to decode what the ancients may have tried to remember for us, the question quietly flips around. What will we choose to remember for whoever comes after us? We've spent this whole journey looking backward, at vanished climates, at ghost populations, at stones that don't fit the story, at monuments that behave more like machines in memory vaults than royal coffins. But there's a point where ancient mystery stops being just an interesting intellectual puzzle and starts becoming a mirror. Because if there really was a civilization or a network of cultures, wise enough to encode knowledge in stone, wise enough to think in cycles, not straight lines, wise enough to say, we may fall, but maybe what we've learned doesn't have to, then we have to ask, what did they know that we don't? What were they trying to warn us about? And are we about to repeat the same pattern? Let's pull the camera back. We like to tell ourselves a comforting story about human progress. That it's always upward, always forward. That every year, every century, we get smarter, more advanced, more humane. That the line from cave paintings to smartphones is clean and inevitable. But the evidence, both ancient and modern, doesn't support that. History looks less like a staircase and more like a heartbeat. Rise. Peak, collapse, rebuild, rise again, forget what came before, repeat. We see it on small scales all the time. Empires that seemed invincible fall within a few generations. Technologies once commonplace vanish and have to be rediscovered centuries later. Complex writing systems are lost, leaving their texts unreadable until someone cracks them. We just don't like thinking about this happening on a global scale. But the climate doesn't care where our borders are. Asteroids don't care whose flag is on the ground. Pandemics don't care what language we swear in, from the perspective of the planet. Civilizations are just brief flashes of energy. The builders of the pyramids, whoever they truly were, seem to have understood that. They saw cycles play out. Maybe they themselves are survivors of an earlier collapse. Maybe they looked at the ruins of their own predecessors the way we now look at theirs. Maybe they watched sea levels rise and swallow coastal cities. Maybe they saw the sky darken after an impact or eruption. Maybe they watched famine, chaos, migration, war, the unraveling of a world that thought it had everything under control. And in the aftermath, when they still had enough organization, enough knowledge, enough resources left to do something ambitious, they made a choice. Not just to rebuild, but to remember, to leave something behind that could survive even if they didn't. They knew texts could burn, stories could be distorted, names could be forgotten. But they also knew that any future civilization would discover the same things they had. The planet is round, not flat. It spins. It wobbles. It has a measurable size and shape. Stars move in patterns you can predict. Ratios like pi and phi show up everywhere in geometry, nature, and structure. So they created a message that didn't rely on culture. A message that didn't require translation. A message written in the constants of reality. You don't need to know their language to read it. You just need to reach a certain level of science, look at the pyramid, and say, wait, these people understood the earth. They encoded it in their architecture. They were thinking in terms of thousands of years. They were us. Now look at where we are. We've reached that level. We've mapped the globe with satellites. We've measured the background radiation of the universe. We've split the atom, sequenced DNA, created machines that think, or at least simulate thinking. We're at a similar point of power and fragility. We can alter the climate. We can deploy technologies that ripple across ecosystems and societies in ways we barely understand. We can create weapons that could end our entire species in a single afternoon. In other words, we may now understand the pyramids, but we still might not understand the warning. Because encoded in those stones, in that entire pattern we've traced, there's a quiet, sobering implication. Civilization is not guaranteed. Knowledge is not permanent. There will be other collapses. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not in our lifetime. But sooner or later, our own peak will crest. The question is not will we fall? Every civilization does. Eventually. The question is, what survives when we do? The ancient builders chose stone. What are we choosing? Skyscrapers made of glass and steel? They'll rust and crumble. Data centers? One EMP, one megastorm, 1 century without maintenance, and they're gone. Even our nuclear waste, which we worry about for thousands of years, will eventually decay into background noise. We assume our modernity makes us harder to erase, but in some ways, it makes us easier. A city is more fragile than a pyramid. A cloud server is more fragile than a carved stone. A hyper-connected, just-in-time, globalized society is much more fragile than a network of simple local communities. So here we are, standing on the same kind of brink the ancient builders might have faced, looking out over our own world of wonders and vulnerabilities. And we have to decide, do we keep pretending we're immune to the cycle, or do we learn from the ones who came before? Maybe the real message of the pyramids isn't just we were here. Maybe it's we were like you. We thought it would last forever. It didn't. So we left something behind for you, in case you climbed as high again. And now that we're here, now that we've reached a point where we can measure the earth and recognize those same measurements in their stones, the responsibility shifts to us. We don't just get to marvel at the mystery. We have to decide what to do with it. There are at least 3 layers to that. Humility, realizing we are not the first, and probably not the last, civilization to reach this level. The universe is not waiting breathlessly for us to succeed. It has seen rises and falls before. It will see them again. Urgency, accepting that our current moment, with our climate, our tech, our weapons, is not a casual experiment. It's a stress test, and we're not guaranteed to pass. Legacy, asking, as the builders did, what matters enough to survive us? And how do we encode it so that whoever comes next can actually read it? We might choose different mediums. Maybe it's stone again. Maybe it's something even more durable. Maybe it's a combination. Resilient physical structures plus seated knowledge in simpler, redundant forms that don't require a global power grid to access. But the principle is the same. Think beyond ourselves. Think in terms of cycles, not lines. Ask, if this all ended tomorrow, what could we leave behind that might help the next version of us climb faster, wiser, safer? Because here's the wild possibility. What if that's exactly what the pyramids did for us? What if, without realizing it, we've already been boosted by that ancient memory? What if certain mathematical concepts, certain symbols, certain mythic structures weren't just randomly invented in multiple places, but were re-remembered, inspired by monuments we didn't fully understand, but couldn't stop staring at? We stand under the same stars those builders mapped. We face the same planetary forces they did. Ice and fire, drought and flood, impact and eruption. We wrestle with the same human flaws: greed, fear, arrogance, tribalism. And now, for the first time since their stones were set, we also share their vantage point. We can see the whole world at once. We can watch the climate change in real time. We can measure just how thin the margin is between stability and chaos. The pyramids and the Sphinx and all the other stone anomalies we talked about, from Göbekli Tepe to Pumapunku, are not just relics of mysterious past. They're mirrors held up to our present. And maybe, if we're smart, blueprints for our future. So, the next time you see an image of the Great Pyramid, don't just see a triangle in the sand. See a message, a data packet, a monument left by people who stood where we stand now, at the edge of their own possible collapse, and decided to carve a lifeline into the bedrock of the planet. We're decoding it. We're starting to understand it. The real question is, what will we do with what they tried to tell us? Let's bring it back to where this all started. Not in theories, not in genetic charts or global maps, but on that strip of desert outside Cairo, on the Giza plateau. Because after everything we've unpacked, the geology, the inscriptions, the anomalies, the ghost populations, the global pattern, we can finally return to those stones with new eyes. We can stand in front of the Sphinx and the pyramids and ask, honestly, were you? Not, what were you supposed to be according to my textbook? Not, what did my tour guide say you were? But, what do you say you are when I look at you without the pre-installed story? The Sphinx speaks first, not in words, but in scars. Its body, carved from living limestone, is shaped by tools, but aged by water. The enclosure that cradles it is grooved vertically, melted into rounded channels that only centuries of heavy rain can carve. Rain that hasn't fallen here for almost 9,000 years. Whatever date we assign to dynastic Egypt, the rock whispers something older. The Egyptians themselves, when they talk about the Sphinx, don't brag about building it. They talk about digging it out, repairing it, rediscovering it. Thutmose for dreams of it buried to its neck in sand, and earns a crown by freeing it. That's not a creator story. That's an heir story. Then there's the Great Pyramid. Inside, it refuses at every turn to behave like a tomb. No hieroglyphic text on the walls of its main chambers. No painted scenes guiding a soul through the underworld. No definitive sarcophagus with clear inscriptions, snugly sealed and obviously meant for a royal corpse. Instead, we get silent granite rooms tuned to specific frequencies, shafts aligned with stars, proportions that encode pi, phi, and Earth's dimensions, an orientation to true north, so precise it rivals modern engineering. We get a structure that's essentially a fusion of mathematics, astronomy, geometry, acoustics, geodesy, wrapped in 6 million tons of precisely placed stone. We also get sealed doors and hidden voids that feel less like, oops, forgot to map that tunnel, and more like, you'll find this when you're ready. Then we step beyond Egypt and see the same patterns. Göbekli Tepe, impossibly old and deliberately buried. Baalbek's Trilithon, absurdly massive foundations with no clear builder. Pumapunku, stones cut with machine-level accuracy in a culture we say lacked the tools. The Hypogeum, tuned like the king's chamber to the same resonant frequency. Sacsayhuaman, Yonaguni, Malta, Karnak, the list goes on. Layer on top of that, climate data showing a greener Sahara and violent shifts around the time these anomalies cluster. Genetic data proving whole populations existed and vanished. Ghost peoples whose DNA persists, even when their cultures, names, and histories do not. Myths and texts, from Egyptian stele to lost Coptic whispers, hinting at monuments older than Egypt itself, built before words and before the river knew its place. When you put all of that on the table at once, the idea that Khufu built a fancy tomb starts to look less like a conclusion and more like a placeholder. A story we told ourselves to avoid confronting a harder truth. The harder truth is this. We are not standing at the beginning of human civilization. We are standing at the edge of a survivor's archive, a library with most of its books burned, but with a few volumes still intact, etched in stone. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the scattered megaliths across the world. These aren't random ancient projects. They're the hard drives that made it through the fire. Once you see that, everything we've talked about snaps into a new shape. The erosion on the Sphinx isn't just weather damage. It's a timestamp. The lack of burial artifacts in the Great Pyramid isn't just an odd omission. It's a clue that you're misreading the genre. This isn't a grave. It's a device. The global spread of similar construction techniques and alignments isn't random coincidence. It's the fading echo of a shared knowledge system. The ghost populations aren't just statistical quirks. They're the missing faces of the builders. Their bodies gone, but their genes still walking around in us. So what do we do with that? We can keep arguing over fine details, which start each shaft lined up with on which date, exactly how many tons each block weighed, whether a specific erosion pattern could maybe be explained by some weird wind effect. Or we can step back and look at the big picture those details fit into. And that picture looks something like this. There was at least one period in the deep past, maybe more, when humans reached a higher level of coordination, knowledge, and technical ability than we currently admit. that world ended. Not declined slowly. Ended catastrophically. Through climate shift, comet impact, sea level rise, or some combination of disasters that smashed the reset button on global culture. Survivors, or the last generations of that world, chose to encode parts of what they knew in stone, in the language of math and sky, because they knew everything else would be lost. Later civilizations, like dynastic Egypt, found these monuments. They restored them, repurposed them, wrapped them in their own beliefs, and, understandably, claimed them as part of their legacy. We, much later, arrived on the scene, saw the last inheritors' fingerprints, and mistook them for the original builders. Now we're finally just advanced enough, scientifically, technologically, archaeologically, to realize we've been reading the story from the middle and calling it the beginning. If that's even partly true, then Giza isn't just an Egyptian site. It's a human site, a message from us, an earlier version of us, to a future us, which, like it or not, is us right now. That puts a different weight on everything. Those stones stop being cool relics from a dead civilization and start feeling like a time-delayed message that's just now reaching its intended audience. A message that says, we were here. We measured the earth. We tracked the sky. We understood cycles. We fell. And silently at the end, what will you do differently? Because the ancients didn't just encode what they knew. They encoded that they knew things we are only rediscovering now. That alone should be a warning. If they got that far and still didn't make it, our own position is not nearly as secure as we like to think. The idea that the pyramids were built as memory vaults, not tombs, suddenly doesn't feel wild at all. In fact, it feels almost inevitable. If you or I were living at the end of our civilization, watching seas rise and skies darken, knowing our descendants might take thousands of years to recover, wouldn't we do the same? Build something that can outlive the storms, both literal and human, encode whatever we thought was most important. How the planet works, how the sky works, the cycles that bring warming and cooling, rain and drought, the math needed to rebuild technology faster next time. We'd choose a medium that can't be hacked, deleted, or casually altered. We'd choose something like this, a triangle in the desert, locked onto true north, humming at a specific frequency, size and shaped like a model of the earth. Call a monument, call a machine, call a message, whatever label you stick on it. One thing becomes very hard to escape. It wasn't built for the kings of the past. It was built for the people of the future. For anyone who could climb back up the long hill of history, rediscover the constants of reality, and stand where we're standing now, at a point where we're finally capable of understanding what the builders already knew, and facing the same choice they did. Reckon honestly with our vulnerability, or pretend we're untouchable and let the cycle repeat. Night falls over Giza now in our time. The last tourists leave. The lights of Cairo flicker in the distance. The desert cools. The Sphinx sits in shadow, rain scars still etched in its flanks, remembering a green world we never knew. The pyramids loom quietly against the stars. The same stars the builders charted. The same constellations their shafts once tracked. They've been here through every story we tell ourselves. Pharaohs and empires. Prophets and conquerors. Scientists and skeptics. Believers and doubters. They watched the world forget what they meant. Now, maybe they're watching the world begin to remember. And as we stand here at the strange intersection of ancient stone and modern knowledge, one last question hangs in the air. If they built for us, what are we going to build for whoever comes after us? Because whether we like it or not, the cycle isn't over yet. The pyramids don't move. We do. We're the ones racing past, changing clothes, changing flags, changing stories. They watch the old gods fall and new ones rise. They watch the night sky slowly shift as Earth's axis wobbles through its 25,920-year cycle. They watch the Nile flood and retreat, watch cities bloom and crumble, watched our species forget and relearn the same lessons again and again. And now, after thousands of years of misunderstanding them, we might finally be meeting them on their own terms, not as tombs, not as tourist attractions, but as a conversation, a message from one cycle of civilization to the next. So let's stand there one last time. You're on the Giza plateau. The air is cooling. The sky is bleeding from orange to deep blue. The last tour bus taillights are fading down the road. The noise of the crowd has dissolved into desert silence. The Sphinx crouches in front of you, half in shadow, its face battered but unbroken. You know now that its scars aren't just from wind and sand. They're from rains that haven't fallen here in nearly 9,000 years. Behind it, the pyramids rise, their edges softened by erosion, but their geometry still exact in all the ways that matter. You're not just looking at Egyptian monuments anymore. You're looking at a time capsule that's outlived multiple versions of humanity's story. The geological record says, "I remember a green Sahara and a climate you don't teach in school." The inscriptions say, "We found these old and buried. We dug them out. We restored them. We never claimed to build them." The math says, "We knew the earth. We knew the sky. We knew the constants you had to rediscover to stand here and understand us." The genetics say, "The people who did this may no longer exist as a culture, but their blood is in you." And the silence says, "Now what?" Because if the pyramids are a question, we're the answer. We are the future they were built for. We're the generation with the tools to scan inside them, to map their alignments precisely, to test their acoustic properties, to compare their geometry to the dimensions of the Earth with satellite-grade accuracy. We're also the generation staring down our own potential catastrophes. Climate disruption, ecological collapse, weapons that can erase entire cities in seconds, technologies that can spiral out of control faster than we can regulate them. The builders weren't naive. They didn't assume their world would last forever. They encoded what they knew. We've spent this entire investigation tracing the evidence that they did. In water erosion, in hieroglyphs, in lost texts, in DNA, in impossible stones scattered across continents. So the real story isn't just, what if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids? It's, what if the pyramids were built for us? To remind us that civilizations rise higher than we'd like to admit and fall harder than we want to imagine. Knowledge can be lost, not just archaic trivia, but deep practical understanding of the planet and sky. Memory, if it isn't anchored in something more durable than paper and pride, will burn. The pyramids are what happens when a culture refuses to let its memory die quietly. They're what happens when someone looks at the horizon and realizes, we might not make it, but maybe our message can. So what was that message? We can't read it in words, but we can infer its shape from everything we've explored. Know your planet. They encoded Earth's dimensions in stone. That's not religion. That's science. They were telling us, this is your home. Learn it. Respect it. Its cycles will shape you whether you're paying attention or not. Know your sky. The star alignments, the precessional codes, the shafts pointing to Sirius and Dubin. All of that says, you are part of something cosmic. Track the heavens. They mark deep cycles you ignore at your peril. Know your fragility. The very existence of an encoded memory vault implies catastrophe. You don't build a stone hard drive if you think your libraries and institutions will last forever. They watch collapse. They expected it to come again. Think beyond your own lifetime. Nobody builds something like the Great Pyramid for themselves. Even pharaohs don't think in 10,000-year timelines. Whoever designed this thought in civilizational cycles, not election cycles. Preserve what matters most. They didn't carve their gossip, their petty wars, their dynastic drama. They carved constants, ratios, alignments, clues to physics and astronomy. The stuff any future science-based culture would care about. In other words, the pyramid doesn't feel like a monument to an ego. It feels like a gift from one version of humanity to another, passed across the dark valley of collapse and forgetting. And now, on this side of that valley, as we stand under the same stars, we're finally beginning to unwrap it. If this journey through forgotten history, stone, and sky has resonated with you, if you feel that we're a mix of awe and unease, you're not alone. There's a reason so many of us are drawn to these questions. Deep down, we know the official story feels too small. We sense that humanity is older, stranger, and more cyclical than the neat timeline suggests. We feel, even if we can't articulate it, that the pyramids are not just ancient, they're relevant. If you want to keep going into this niche, these cracks in the official narrative, these places where geology, genetics, and myth collide, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a like if this kind of deep dive content is something you want more of. It genuinely helps push these ideas into more people's recommended feeds. And tell me in the comments, where are you in the world? What time is it for you right now? And after hearing all of this, what do you think the pyramids were built for? Your thoughts aren't just engagement. They become part of the investigation. A collective mind trying to remember something our species might once have known. For now, though, night has fully settled over Giza. In your mind's eye, the tourists are gone. The fences and signs and souvenir stands have faded into darkness. What's left are the silhouettes. The Sphinx, low and watchful. The pyramids, black triangles against a field of stars. Above them, the constellations will slowly, the same sky the builders mapped, the same precessional dance they encoded into stone. You can almost feel the weight of time pressing down. Not just 4,500 years, maybe 10,000, maybe more. Empires have bloomed and crumbled in that span. Languages have been born and died. Religions have risen and fallen. Entire peoples have vanished into genetic ghosts. But the stones are still here, still aligned, still humming at their resonant frequencies, still whispering, in the only language that survives everything: geometry, astronomy, mathematics. Stone, the pyramids remember. They remember a green Sahara and a different sky. They remember hands that carved and set them with a purpose we are only now beginning to rediscover. They remember a civilization that knew it would not last, and loved knowledge enough to try to send it forward anyway. Tonight, when you look up at your own sky, in whatever city, village, or countryside you're in, know this. You are standing in the same story. Not above it, not after it, in it. Another peak in the same long human cycle. And somewhere in the darkness beyond your horizon, those ancient stones are still watching, waiting, holding their memory, until we decide what ours will be. Sleep under your own stars tonight. Dream of green Saharas and forgotten ages. And remember, we are not the first to stand here and wonder. We will not be the last. The cycle continues. Memory endures. And the stones, as always, keep watch.